We'll go now to the presentation. Sorry, I didn't start at the beginning. Okay, here we go. Starting at the beginning. The name of my church in Chicago was St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. It was the only Episcopal church on the west side of Chicago for a distance of about 8 miles. There had been another Episcopal church nearby that was called the Church of the Epiphany, and they will figure in the slideshow a little later. Church of the Epiphany was the much larger of the two. It was a high society church. And my church, St. Andrew's Church, was spun off of that to serve the growing African-American community on Chicago's west side. Some of you have probably been to Chicago. It's a beautiful city, really. It's got an energy to it, a lot of interesting architecture that was all built after the Great Fire in the 1870s. This is a scene of Grant Park, named for Ulysses S. Grant, the President of the United States after the Civil War. It fronts on Lake Michigan, and it's a beautiful and well-to-do downtown area. Chicago is a fairly new town compared to England. It was only founded in 1833, was the founding date of the city. And so it grew rapidly. And on the west side of Chicago, it was all laid out in a grid pattern, as many American cities are. But there's a huge contrast between the west side of Chicago and the very prosperous downtown. The west side of Chicago became the area where industry was developed, where immigrants first came, and it became the place where they built the large auditorium, the Chicago Auditorium, which hosted for many years political conventions. Now, the word about Chicago that you have heard in the past, probably, you've heard it called the Windy City. It can have a bit of a breeze in Chicago. It's in the middle of the prairie. There's not a whole lot of mountains breaking up the wind that comes across from the west. But the reason it's called the Windy City has nothing to do with the weather. It's called the Windy City because it was a city of conventions. Chicago was the fastest growing city in the United States after the Civil War. It went from a small town to being the second largest city in the country in a matter of 20 or 30 years. There was a massive influx of immigrants from Northern Europe, and it was at a time when the railroads were developing, so it became the railroad hub of the country, and it became the place where much of the country's industry was established. Immigrants by the thousands flooded into Chicago, and they got jobs in places like this. This is the McCormick Reaper plant. It was built by Cyrus McCormick and his descendants. They manufactured agricultural harvesting equipment to harvest corn, wheat, rye, oats, and so forth, because Chicago essentially marked the beginning of the prairie and the Great Plains. The native peoples had just been driven off, and European immigrants were flooding in and cultivating the land in European farm style. This was also the place where the American labor movement got its start in so many ways in the industries. And as the American labor movement grew, one of the big issues was the hours of work. People typically worked anywhere from 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week under miserable conditions, no unionization, no rest. In the early 1880s, an idea seized hold of the early labor movement. It was the 8-hour day movement. And what they declared their goal to be was there would be 8 hours of work, 8 hours for what you wanted to, and 8 hours for rest. It was seen as important social legislation. And so they began to try to negotiate that into their contracts, and they began to agitate for it in legislation. At its founding convention in 1885, the American Federation of Labor called for the national strike to take place on the following year, on the 1st of May, 1886. They called for workers in affiliated shops all over the United States to walk out on that day and to demonstrate in massive rallies and parades for the 8-hour day. One of the largest of the parades was held in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, when 80,000 workers marched down the streets of Chicago. The next day, at the McCormick Reaper plant, where a strike was currently underway, the police charged the picket line, trying to bring strike breakers through the line. The workers on strike resisted. The police opened fire, and several striking union members were killed at that McCormick Reaper plant. What the Chicago labor movement did in response to that is they called for a rally to be held at the corner of Randolph Street and Des Plaines on the west side of Chicago. Notice that this notice of the rally is in English and German. Much of the early labor movement in Chicago was led by German workers who had come over from Germany, who had some experience with trade unionism in Germany. Some of them had fled to Chicago after the failure of the Revolution of 1848. And at the time, Chicago was the second or third largest German-speaking city in the world, after Berlin and Hamburg. So they called for a rally. This would have been on May the 3rd at the corner of Randolph and Des Plaines on the west side. What happened, though, was the police came to the rally and attempted to break it up. A bomb went off. Nobody knows who threw the bomb, whether it was an anarchist, a policeman, a provocateur. It exploded in the front ranks between the police and the strikers. The 2 policemen were killed immediately. The police opened fire. They were carrying repeater rifles, Winchester repeater rifles, which had been developed for use in the Plains Wars against the native peoples. And these were turned upon the workers of the city of Chicago. Speaking at the time on the wagon, which had been drawn up and served as the impromptu speaker's platform, was Samuel Fielden. He was a Methodist lay preacher. He was the next to the last speaker to speak, and he never finished his speech. What happened in the wake of this terrible confrontation, we don't know how many workers were killed, maybe as many as 30 or 40. The police and the hammer of the authorities came down on the labor movement, not just in Chicago, but all around the country. Police went into union halls, arrested union leaders, searched for documents, smashed things, destroyed property, arrested the Chicago union leaders who were behind the 8-hour day movement, some of whom were not even at this rally. And they put them on trial and made an example of them. And of course, this is the group of men, the 7 Haymarket martyrs, who were tried in a courtroom in Chicago, Illinois, in a kangaroo trial. They were found guilty of conspiring to murder the 2 policemen who were killed by the bomb. Some of the guys were not even at the rally. The prosecuting attorney said, well, we may not have evidence against all of them, but it's an important thing is to make an example of them because their ideas are dangerous. The ideas of workers' rights and the 8-hour day. 4 of them were hanged. A 5th died in his cell, his head partially blown off by a blasting cap. 2 were sent to long prison terms in prison. The city council forbid the burial of their bodies in the city of Chicago, so they had to go outside the boundaries of the city of Chicago on the west side to a German cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois, where they were buried. The World Labor Movement raised funds to erect this monument, which is erected in the early 1890s. It's still there, and it's a place of pilgrimage for people of the labor movement from all over the world. Here's a picture that was taken. I took a group of my union members there shortly before moving over here to England. You also see Caroline there, of course. This is the monument to the Haymarket Martyrs. In 1893, the new governor of Illinois, John Peter Alkeld, investigated the circumstances around the trial, found that they had been victims of an injustice, and he pardoned them all. Of course, 5 of them were already dead. The other 2 were released from prison, and their bodies were eventually interred here as well. To honor the sacrifice of the Haymarket Martyrs, at the International Workingmen's Association meeting in Paris in 1889, a resolution was passed making the 1st of May International Labor Day. So it started in Chicago, but the May Day holiday that we observe in Britain and everywhere else around the world started in Chicago because of the sacrifice of these men. Ironically enough, one of the few countries in the world where it is not an official holiday is the country where it started, the United States. And the history that has been told to our people minimizes and ignores this important event and the symbolism of it. But I'm pleased to say that the labor movement in recent years has really come around, has gathered around the holiday. This is a picture of the May Day March in Chicago just a few years ago. You can see that the idea has not been forgotten. And this is a scene from the May Day March in our own city here of London. The site of the rally, which was unmarked for years, finally, after the Illinois Labor History Society worked for many years, finally got the city of Chicago to agree to put up a monument. This is the monument that was erected on the very site of the wagon that was pulled up where the speakers were standing. And now along the base of the monument are plaques that have been installed from labor unions around the world in solidarity with the martyrs of Chicago. And it's a place now where you bring people and you teach them about the meaning of May Day. And so here you see a teacher teaching a union crowd standing on the monument about May Day. The west side of Chicago is also the home of Hull House. Hull House was built by Jane Addams. She came to England in the 1880s and saw Toynbee Hall, which was a settlement house providing help to low-income people. You all know about Toynbee Hall, I'm assuming, in the East End of London. She came back to Chicago, raised money, and built this marvelous facility. It's called Hull House. It was named for the man whose house originally stood on the property, who donated the property. And this is Jane Addams herself meeting with immigrant children. It was a place that welcomed immigrants. It was a place that helped workers organize unions. It helped train women. It was a place for women's liberation. And Jane Addams later received the Nobel Peace Prize. This is all on the west side of Chicago. This is a picture of Lucy Parsons. She is the widow of Albert Parsons, who was the only American-born martyr of the Haymarket Martyrs. All the others were German immigrants. Albert Parsons was born and raised in Texas. A white man, he married Lucy Parsons in Texas, who was of mixed African, Indian, and Mexican ethnicity. It caused quite a stir in Texas at the time. They were an amazing couple. She survived. Of course, she was not hanged with her husband. She lived a long time and became a leader in so many movements in Chicago. In 1915, she organized and led a march against hunger in Chicago, and it started at Hull House. And it was at Hull House that this song was sung for the first time.
Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, oh us strong.
In 1916, there began an amazing migration within the United States. From 1916 to 1970, in what was called the Great Migration, more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South moved to the North, to the cities of the North, to seek opportunities to escape Jim Crow segregation in the South and to try to find a way to make a better living than they experienced as former slaves and the children of slaves in the Jim Crow, Ku Klux Klan ruled South. So starting in 1916, this massive migration took place, and thousands upon thousands of African Americans came into Chicago, and like other immigrants before who came from Europe, they also came to the West Side, where housing was in really bad shape. It was a terrible, difficult place to live, and not just in Chicago, but in the ghettos of New York. So over the years, the government developed programs to replace the deteriorated housing, and they built these massive public housing projects on the West Side and on the South Side in largely segregated quarters for the African American community. It was a miserable failure. These houses were better than the slums that had been previously occupied, but the housing was built basically stacking poor people upon poor people with few community services in the area and so forth. So the West Side of Chicago over this period of time from 1916 to 1970 became an 8-mile stretch of largely Black population, largely economically deprived, and that was the neighborhood into which I went to serve in my church. Some of the buildings were better than others. But in the middle of this neighborhood, people always organized. This is a picture of Fred Hampton. He was one of the founding members of the Black Panther Party. He grew up in Maywood, Illinois, not far from where Caroline and I lived on the west side of Chicago. He moved into the heart of the West Side, not far from my church, and he began to do community organizing. Fred was a socialist in terms of his economics and his political outlook. He was a liberation fighter for the African American community. The Black Panther Party was a militant group of young Black men and women, not just in Chicago, but around the country, who were organizing their communities, began arguing for justice, for legislation. And what was controversial to the police was they armed themselves to protect themselves against abuse by the police. Fred became a noted speaker in community meetings and before city and state investigation bodies. One of the things that the Black Panther Party did that was eventually copied by the entire American school system was they provided breakfast. Many families in the west side of Chicago couldn't afford to give their kids a good breakfast in the morning. The Black Panther Party organized breakfast and lunch programs for thousands upon thousands of Black kids on the west side, and my church was one of the places they used for the breakfast program, which was eventually adopted by the public schools in Chicago, but it was pioneered by the Black Panther Party. Another leader of the African American community who spent considerable time in Chicago was the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Shown here on one of his visits to Chicago, he led the fight for open housing on the west side of Chicago. Housing was segregated in the city of Chicago. It is still de facto segregated today. At the time he was leading his organization in the 60s, this housing was segregated by law and by illegal practices by real estate managers. So this shows Dr. King in a house in a previously all-white neighborhood that he was urging be opened up to be rented and purchased by Black families. It wasn't long after that, however, that Dr. King was slain in Memphis. He was in Memphis in support of striking sanitation workers, and he was shot down while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. What happened after that is all over the United States, cities exploded in anger and rage and frustration. The West Side went up in flames. Huge sections of it went up in flames as frustrated and angry people took to the streets in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. This is a picture taken not far from where my church stands. This was in 1968, April of 1968. And today on the West Side, it looks like this. There are great gaps where businesses and houses used to be. The FBI worked with the Chicago police and other police forces around the country to target, isolate, and frankly, assassinate the up-and-coming leaders of the Black community, including the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton lived in a house 2 blocks from my church. This is the house. In 1969, 16 policemen burst into the house, firing their guns, and they killed Fred and Mark Clark in their own bedrooms. Later investigations proved that this was a planned assassination, and it was done with the covert support of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. The funeral of Fred Hampton, that's his bedroom. The funeral of Fred Hampton was held at the Church of the Epiphany, the Episcopal Church down the street from my church. It has now been closed, but people from St. George's will be amused to know, I think, that all the vestments that I wear at St. George's are from this church, the Church of the Epiphany. And people by the thousands turned out for Fred's funeral. I've become acquainted with Fred's family, his mother and his sons. They are regular attendees at rallies in Chicago for racial justice. The West Side didn't always look like this. It used to look like that. This is one of the few blocks that has survived all the turmoil and the real estate magnates and the riots and the fires and the poverty. This is more what it looks like now for 8 miles stretching out from the center of the city of Chicago out to the suburbs. And at one time, there had been significant industry on the West Side. This is where people came and worked in jobs. This is the Brock's Candy Company. But this is what it looks like today. This is the world headquarters for Sears Roebuck. This is what it looks like today. And some of the public housing was built with great hopes in the 1960s, has now been torn down because it wasn't maintained. There is a sociologist that moved into the neighborhood where my church is shortly before I was there, a few years before I was there. His name was Alex Kotlowitz, and he wrote this book. I highly recommend it if you want to understand what it's like to live in the segregated ghettos of the American experience. This is a good book. There Are No Children Here. It documents the story of 2 boys who grew up in the neighborhood where my church was. So the West Side of Chicago, even today, is a neighborhood that struggles. It's one of the highest levels of poverty, has some of the highest unemployment in the state of Illinois. It's still virtually segregated. It's still virtually 99% Black. Jobs are scarce. It's a food desert. Up until recently, there were no grocery stores within miles of my church. Proper grocery stores selling fresh produce. Schools are in crisis. They're poorly maintained. Schools are supported by the local tax base. There's very little in the West Side to tax, so there's not much money for the schools. High crime rate. The West Side of Chicago has been taken over by gangs. And you've heard about the gun violence in Chicago. It is a huge problem on the West Side of Chicago. High incarceration rate. About a third of the men in what we would call my parish have at one time spent time in prison. It's that high. And the way the American welfare system works is if you're poor, but both parents are in their home, unless one of the parents is disabled, you won't get benefits. So typically what happens is, in order to help the family survive, the father must move out. So there are many fatherless families in poor neighborhoods because that's how they get eligibility for aid to dependent children. Drugs are rampant. The gangs are involved in the drug trade, and the drugs are sold not just to poor people in the neighborhoods who are crack addicts and heroin addicts by the most part, the ones that are addicted, but well-to-do people drive into the black neighborhoods to pick up their drugs. There was a store in the corner across from my church, and I never forget the day that it was Christmas Day, and I showed up at church a little early to open up because it was Christmas Day. And the gangs were out in front on the corner, and I watched as they were passing baggies full of white powder into cars who stopped and giving them money on Christmas Day morning. We eventually succeeded in getting that grocery store. It was not a proper grocery store. It was basically a liquor store. We got it shut down because it was being used as a basis for the drug trade. Here's a map of percentage of people living in poverty. You will see that on the west side of Chicago here, some of the darker spots, the poverty rate is anywhere from 25 to 60% of the population. You'll also see that there's a high correlation between poverty and death, homicide, murders. Empty houses serve as places where gangs hide out and where they stash their drugs. These are all within 2 blocks of my church. This is a gang map of the west side of Chicago. To me, I didn't see anything on the street that said anything about gangs. When we created a choir for the kids at the neighborhood schools, the teacher said, well, we'll have to walk the kids over after school is over. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, your church is on one side of the gang boundary and the school is on the other. We have to cross a gang boundary. I said, what? It never occurred to me. And our side of the gang boundary was the territory of the Latin Kings, which is in purple. On the other side, in the gray, was the Black disciples. And I thought, well, at least they're disciples. But gangs have virtually carved up the city of Chicago for areas of control, for areas in which they enjoy a monopoly of the drug trade. And it was something I had to learn about. And it's something we had to take into consideration anytime we did anything with the children in the neighborhood. We had to provide safe corridors and adult guidance to and from the church. Scenes like this are fairly common. Sometimes you see a group of men hanging out on a corner. It might just be people who are neighbors talking to each other. But very often it's people on the lookout, looking out for any police coming by to interrupt the drug trade. Here's some pictures of some members of the West Side gangs. You know, each gang has its own sign that they flash with their hands. If you are walking in a neighborhood and somebody walks up and flashes a gang sign at you, you better flash back the right gang sign, or you might very well be in trouble. If you were black and young and walking into another neighborhood where you didn't know the gang sign and you flashed the wrong gang sign, you could even be shot. The gang sign on the right, by the way, is the gang sign for the Latin Kings. The three fingers imitate a crown, which is one of their symbols, and it's sprayed on buildings in our neighborhood. And it's important to understand that recruiting into gangs begins early. This man here on the left with the fine chain around his neck, his name is King Vaughn. He's a member of the Latin Kings. This is his illegitimate son by a woman in the community who he is grooming to join his gang, and probably already has. They come to the elementary schools and start recruiting their brothers and sisters into the gangs as early as age 7. So, welcome to the parish. This is where St. Andrew's Episcopal Church is. This is our little church. It was built in 1950. It was the second building of the congregation. It was built again to give a place for African American Episcopalians to worship that wouldn't be at the Church of the Epiphany, because after all, that was for all those rich white people over there. This is the interior of the church. I think it's not without its charm. It's very simple. The Bishop of Chicago said it's sort of monastic, and I have to agree. This reminds me a lot of the Church of St. Peter that was built by St. Ced in the county of Kent, if you've ever, or county of Essex, if you've ever been out there. This is a painting that hung in our church. It's a painting that was painted in memory of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It was painted by a man who lived in the halfway house next door. St. Andrew's is connected to the St. Leonard's Ministries. It was founded by the St. Andrew's Church. It's a halfway house for men coming out of the prison system, helping them get adjusted to life outside the prison, helping give them training and so forth. And many of those men were my parishioners. At St. George's, we did a lot of dinners. This shows one of our dinners where we invited in the neighborhood after services. People come to the service and they come down and have some good soul food in our basement. The lady on the left, that's Rachel Brown. She is now 96 years old, still going strong, one of the leaders of our community there. Some of you who are members of St. George's will recognize this. This is Palm Sunday. And yes, I played the bagpipes in the middle of this gang-dominated neighborhood. The gangs generally left me alone. They had a tendency to show respect for members of the clergy, even though I was clearly from outside the neighborhood. We designed these shirts and distributed them in the neighborhood as part of our mission work there. This shows a flyer. At the bottom of these flyers are tear-off cards that we could hang on people's doorknobs, inviting people from the neighborhood to come and worship with us and join us for dinner. This is the front door of St. Andrew's Church. It shows what it looked like before we removed the gate. These cast iron gates that are in front of the church were installed about 20 years ago by some members of the congregation because drug addicts were sitting on the steps and shooting up. I didn't like the gates. I thought it kept the community out, which in fact was what it was designed for. We talked with the congregation and I said, let's get rid of the gates, and they agreed. So on one glorious day, we took the gates off. The bishop came, members of the community came. Now there was no bar to getting into St. Andrew's Church. And we all took a picture, feeling very proud of ourselves. We had some amazing members of my congregation in those days. This is Corey Marshall. I remember when she was born. She's from a Jewish secular family. She went off on a program to Cuba. The medical school in Cuba, the big medical school, which has got a very good reputation, had a program of inviting working class American kids to come down to Cuba for a free professional medical education. And the MD degree you get from the Havana University of the Havana School of Dentistry is recognized all over the United States and in other countries too as a very high quality degree. You don't have to do anything extra when you come home with a degree from Cuba. So she went down there and the Cuban government paid for her education. The only thing they ask of the graduates is that they go home and that they serve the poor communities when they go home. And so she joined my church and worked as a doctor in the hospitals on the west side. Corey Marshall was her name. This is Jesse. Jesse is a convicted murderer. He spent most of his life in prison for killing someone, and he confessed that to us one day when he came to church. We welcomed him, and he became one of our regular readers. He was one of the pillars of the church. This is a man who's been on a journey, and he has turned his life around. But several of the members of our congregation were convicted murderers. Here we are at sermon time on a typical Sunday. This is not a typical Sunday here. It usually wasn't this full. But this is St. Andrew's Church on a good Sunday. Among the things that we were engaged with at St. Andrew's Church, St. Andrew's had a reputation for engaging with the community on issues of social justice, going back to the time of the Black Panther Party, when we partnered with them in the late 60s, and well, it was in the 60s. It didn't go into the 70s. With the school breakfast program, the school lunch program we had at St. Andrew's. So when I stepped into this congregation, I was stepping into the shoes of people who'd been there before and had done a lot of work in the community. I had a special relationship with the teachers union when they went on strike over wages and classroom size, which they felt was an important thing for the kids. St. Andrews became a location of strike support for the teachers of the surrounding schools. And we had a special Labor Day Sunday service with members of the teachers union. One of their leaders came and spoke during the service, Deborah Pope. This was a sign that we hung outside the church. And this was a thank you given to me by the teachers at our neighborhood school for supporting them during their strike. Gun violence is a huge problem in Chicago. Chicago has good gun control laws. The problem with Chicago is that it is at the hub of the nation. All sorts of stuff comes through Chicago. And right next door to Chicago is the state of Indiana, which has it has very weak gun control legislation. And there's a big gun shop right on the border over into Indiana, where most of the guns that are purchased and are used in crime in Chicago and in killings, they can all be traced to that gun shop. This is Trayvon Martin, a young boy who was killed, not in Chicago, but he was walking through his father's neighborhood. He was pursued by a vigilante who drew his gun on him. They struggled. The vigilante shot and killed him. This is a little girl who lived near our church, about 10 blocks west of our church. She was selling candy and punch from a little stand in front of her mom's house, and she got caught up in a gang crossfire and she was killed. Her name was Heaven Sutton. These are some of her friends who came to her house. It's difficult being a kid in some of these neighborhoods. Here's some footage from Heaven's funeral. The killing of Heaven Sutton really aroused the neighborhood in a new way, and coalitions were built. This shows a number of clergy gathering at the big congregational church about a half-mile east of my church on the west side. We began to make demands for gun control. The trouble is, Illinois could improve its laws, but as long as Indiana doesn't do anything about its laws across the border, as long as there isn't national gun control, we can't get a handle on it. This was a march sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago. It marched from the cathedral to the hospital, where so many of the victims of gun violence are taken. And this is part of our delegation in that march. I became involved with other clergy and legislative advocacy around gun control, and frankly, reaching out to the gangs. The Ceasefire Organization has done some amazing work with ex-gang members who are called to tense situations where something's about to interrupt and they come in with their staff and they try to defuse the situation. One thing you probably never thought you'd have to put on the door of a church in England, and frankly, I never thought I'd have to do it here in Chicago either, but this sign. This was on our door. We were telling people they can't bring guns into the church. So if you don't tell them that, at least in some of the states, you can come armed into a church, into a house of God. One of the things we did to sort of build up the community, we created a children's choir. We called it the UBUNTU Children's Choir, which we'll define in a moment. It's a South African word. And here's a shot of our choir in the early days. It grew a little bit after this. This was one of the first times they sang in church. The schools had funding cutbacks, so most of the schools no longer had a music program. So we hired the lady on the right there, that's Nikki Krebash. She sang in the choir at the church in Oak Park, which is the sister church of St. George's, Grace Episcopal Church. And she became the choir director of our children's choir at St. Andrew's Church. And we reached out to the local schools and they began bringing children over, again with teacher escorts because they were crossing gang boundaries. Here's the flyer we produced to attract the children. See a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The other fight that we had involving the schools was the Chicago Board of Public Education, none of whose members are elected, none of whose children are actually in the state schools. These are the elite of Chicago who make decisions about what happens to the state schools. They announced plans to close 30 schools in Chicago. I believe that was the number. Nearly all of them in neighborhoods of Black and Latino population. And there were 2 schools in our immediate vicinity, and they were closing one of them and forcing the kids to go to the other school, even though the other school was in a different gang territory. They didn't even take that into consideration. I testified before the Board of Education speaking out against it. This is the school everybody was going to be crammed into. This is the ethnic composition of the debt school students. This was the school that was being closed and the children being moved over to Herbert School. And you can see 94.6% African-American population, others much less. It's reflecting the segregation of the community. So there was a big struggle in Chicago. There was a march that began on the far west side and came through our neighborhood. We became a stop-off place at St. Andrews in support of the hundreds of marchers who were marching downtown to protest the closing of the schools. We fed them, of course, because that's what St. Andrews did a lot. We gave everybody a letter inviting them to the church, telling them we stood with them. We served up a lot of fried chicken that day. And this was the march later on. In the downtown area, you see Jesse Jackson in the black jacket and the black hat. To his left, holding on to his arm, is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And this is a scene on one of the busiest streets in downtown Chicago. There were thousands of people gathered downtown to protest the closing of the schools. And 130 of us decided we were just going to sit down and block the streets, including me. The outcome was predictable. This is me getting arrested. Unfortunately, we were not able to stop the closing of the schools. Another struggle, getting a fair wage, a living wage for the low-income workers of Chicago. The fight for 15. The fight for 15 means $15 an hour, roughly the equivalent of a 10-pound an hour salary here. This is a banner we had up in, a sign we had up in the church. I preached on this a lot and pointed out that Jesus is actually the original protester. And here we are getting in trouble again. I was joined in this troublemaking by Jan Schakowsky, an old friend who was a member of Congress from Chicago, a Democrat. This is a scene from a moment early in the morning. At 7 o'clock, I was asked to accompany a group of workers who worked at the local McDonald's in downtown Chicago, who had been out on strike to demand $15 an hour. And you see, it's illegal to fire someone if they go on strike, but it's not illegal to permanently replace them. Now you tell me what the difference is. So I went along to make sure that all these workers got hired back, and I think the collar had little influence, and the employer did take them all back. That was at 7 in the morning, one morning in downtown Chicago. Here's another demonstration. This one is specifically of clergy. We're standing outside a Walmart in downtown Chicago, making the same demand of the Walmart pay its people $15 an hour. They recognize the right of their employees to unionize. You'll see there's a policeman in the back there. We agreed in advance that we would block the streets until we got arrested as a sign of solidarity with the workers, and we were arrested. This actually shows Caroline and me outside a Walmart on the west side of Chicago. Here I'm confronting a security guard. We were outside the Walmart. Since it was on private property, we were told we could not hand out flyers. So we said, okay, we'll shop. So we went inside, and I asked for the manager, and I spoke with the manager and advocated that they begin to pay $15 an hour to their workers, which would be closer to the living wage in Chicago. Did we succeed? No, not quite. But one of the bright things is that we have made some difference with all this. You see, in the United States, the federal minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour. That's roughly about £4.50 an hour. That wage hasn't gone up since 1979. But in part due to the effort we raised in the fight for 15 and getting unions behind it, the city of Chicago has now established a minimum wage of $13.50 an hour. Not quite 15, but we're getting there. And if it's a larger employer with 21 or more employees, they pay $14 an hour. So we've made some difference. Another difference we've made in recent years is this is Pete's Fresh Market. The neighborhood where my church was, ever since 1968, when much of the neighborhood went up in flames, has been a food desert. There hasn't been a grocery store with fresh produce and real food within miles of that church. This is now 6 blocks from my church. It's the first grocery store to be built on the west side of Chicago since 1968, and they made a commitment to hire local people, so it was also a creation of jobs. Another sign of hope on the west side. This is the new mayor of Chicago, just elected last year. Only the second black mayor in the history of the city, only the second woman mayor in the history of the city, and the first lesbian to be elected mayor of the city of Chicago. This is Lori Lightfoot, and she has brought some much needed reforms. Not always agreeing with the teachers union, which continues to lead the fight, but she's pretty good. Better than we had before. And this is the teachers union, the largest union in the city. It has really led the fight of the progressive movement in the city of Chicago. They have a militant and well-organized membership. This is also a sign of hope. And Fred Hampton hasn't been forgotten either. Fred was an inspiration to so many young people. His story continues to be told on the west side of Chicago, the need to build up coalitions and fight for justice, fight for jobs, fight for housing, fight against hunger. This is a wall mural about 3 blocks from my church on the west side. Just a few quotes to reflect on. You've seen that what has happened in Chicago has required a lot of struggle to make any headway. And sometimes we've broken the law to do it. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist leader in the 19th century, and this is what he said about struggle. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar. It's an important lesson. All the progress we have ever made in Chicago and in the United States for that matter has been the result of struggle and not always peaceful. Sometimes it's been very difficult. So where's the church in all this? Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it pretty well. I'll just leave this up there for you to consider. Bonhoeffer was one of the German Christian leaders that opposed fascism, and he eventually paid for it with his life in 1945. And this is Allie Bridges, one of my youngest church members. She's also a sign of hope. She's wearing that t-shirt, "Be the change you want to see in the world." This was taken in 2013. She's a young woman now and she's heading off to university. We're all very proud of her. So we'll leave the slideshow with that little sign of hope. All right. Jane just joined us. I'm sorry I didn't see Jane was in the waiting room. There you have it, a little crash course on the west side of Chicago.